So we always hear with Ukraine that this is the Russia's war of aggression, an unprovoked war. That Russia just invaded its neighbor, its small neighbor, and has been committing these war crimes, these atrocities. How do you respond to these statements? The statement that this is an unprovoked war, that it's a Russian war of aggression.
Right. No, it's very much a provoked war. Russia has been warning, has pretty much said that Ukraine is a red line, especially NATO membership for Ukraine. And it's not something that they came up with in 2021, right before the war broke out, but they've been saying it since the beginning. We can go all the way back to 1991 or even earlier, actually, I think 1989, where Western officials made promises to the Russian government that NATO would not advance eastward, not an inch eastward. And it was based on that promise. And Gorbachev himself has repeated this, is that he agreed to really let go of the Warsaw Pact countries, East Germany, for example. It was this agreement that led to the tearing down of the Berlin Wall.
Can I interrupt you just a second?
Yeah.
So I always hear this not 1 inch to the east for NATO
Right.
expansion, this agreement. Some people say that there was never any formal agreement, that it was only kind of a verbal agreement or a
Right.
handshake or nothing, any paper that's signed wasn't truly official. Is there any truth to those statements?
There was never an official treaty. There actually are written records. I can't list all of them, but there was James Baker was one person who was involved in the negotiations. This was something that was oral. Gorbachev should have made it into a treaty. He didn't. He simply trusted the other side, and that's often enough. If you. But he made a mistake in placing trust in the Western side. Now, it seems to me that's hardly an excuse. Well, we didn't actually make it a formal treaty, so we can break our promise. It was a promise, and it's something that we should have kept. It was clearly a matter of great concern to Russia. And as we began to spread, as we began to move NATO to the east, they started ringing the alarm bells. And then they made it crystal clear, that Ukraine would, no matter what, that was the red line. They were upset about the expansion, but the Ukraine would be the last straw, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And we have, it's not just the Russians who were saying that, but there were many leading American officials. Probably the best known is George Kennan, was, maybe if not the greatest statesman of the second half of the 20th century, he certainly was one of them. He was actually the architect of the original Cold War policy, containment policy. But he said, very clearly in the 1990s that is a huge mistake for NATO to move eastward, and that it would eventually elicit, a forceful Russian response. And when the Russians finally responded militarily, this is actually his words. He said that the West would say that, look, this is why we have to, the Russians are clearly, the aggressors, and this is why we had to do it all along. And that's what happened. He actually was very, very prophetic. But it wasn't just him. There was also the Secretary of Defense of the time, the last ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock. All these people were warning that there were many people. It's not unusual, actually, to hear warnings about the dangers of expanding eastward back in the 1990s up through the early 2000s. But eventually, these voices were silenced, and the Russians became more alarmed. There was a very famous, you say, a memo that was sent by the U.S. ambassador to Russia at that time, who was the current. That was William Burns, who is the current CIA director. This memo is titled, or is known as "Niet means Niet." Is what he said. This was sent back to Washington, D.C. He said, "Look, the Russians are really serious about this. That Ukraine, if we try to bring Ukraine into NATO, they will respond. It'll mean war." So we knew. So that's the thing, is we knew how serious this was, and we decided to ignore it. And then again, as we got closer and closer to the outbreak of war, the Russians started ringing the alarm bells louder, late 2021. They say, look, we need to negotiate this. This has got to end, right? And we simply uh, refused to negotiate with them. We actually had, well, Biden at one time said it conceded a little bit. He said, okay, we won't put missiles into Ukraine. And then Tony Blinken shortly after that walked it back. They wouldn't do anything. They simply wouldn't listen to the Russians. The Russians had a real legitimate concern. You know, this was right on their border. Now think about it. It's just like when the Russians installed ICBMs in Cuba, what did we do? We brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, right? Well, we were planning to go to make Ukraine, you know, which is borders Russia, right, not very far from Moscow, and 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 we also refused um, to make any promises about keeping missiles out of Ukraine. So, you know, why is it that we could respond to the, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis and one, but for some reason Russia has no security concerns of its own? Clearly, it did. We knew it. They told us. They told us again and again. We ignored it. We provoked them. We knew that it meant war, and it ended up being.
Well, I mean, Ukraine's never joined NATO, right? So why would
Well, that's the problem. Is they say, okay, let's make a promise that Ukraine does not join NATO, and then that's, well, and so why would Russia not want Ukraine to join NATO? Well, you think about it. I mean, it says Ukraine was building up its forces, was insisting. It already, in the months prior to the outbreak of the war, is they declared that they had the intention of retaking those territories. Not that Russia had taken, you know, we're talking about the Donbass, um, which were taken by local militia who broke, you know, in a civil war, ended up with these territories, part of Donetsk and part of Lugansk, and then Crimea, which was joined Russia after a referendum. It was their declared intention to take them back. They were building up forces. It looked like they had every intention of carrying that out, you know, of making good on their promise. Um, Now, if Ukraine had been in NATO at the time, what would that have meant? That would have meant that if a conflict arose between Russia and Ukraine, if Ukraine invaded or began a military operation to reconquer those territories, then if Russia responded, it would be Article 5 and a war between Russia and all of NATO. That's what they were looking at, and so it was clear, you know. So the way the Russians understood it, they saw a threat, right? You know, a dagger pointed right at their heart, and they 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 did pursue diplomatic solutions. You know, we mentioned there was that flurry of diplomatic activity right before the war began, the offers, you know, the warnings, but we can go back a little farther, a few years earlier, 2014, 2015, when the Minsk Accords, right, were drawn up. Now, again, that was an effort to avoid war. It was actually it was an offer actually also for an opportunity for Ukraine to regain those territories against the will of the local people who did want to rejoin Russia, the people of Donetsk and Lugansk. But for all those years, 2015 all the way through 2022, there was no effort on the side of Ukraine to actually implement those accords, which would have given them sovereignty over these Russians, but granted those two regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, but granting them a certain amount of autonomy. There was an opportunity to do that. They clearly had no intention, and instead they built up their forces. So again, Russia saw what was happening and chose to respond militarily. Again, I would say just clearly they were provoked. When they were trying to look for alternative solutions, you know, they were refused. They had the door slammed in their face again and again.
Pre 2014, did the majority of Ukrainians want to be part of NATO?
No. Yeah, these surveys showed consistently, time and again, year after year, that only 20% of the Ukrainian population wanted to join NATO. So this was something that was pushed by the West, pushed by the US, by NATO, and by elites within Ukraine. but not
So
by the
was
people.
was the whole coup in 2014, the Maidan coup, was that simply to put a government in power that would allow Ukraine to join NATO
I think so. Yeah. I mean, that was, uh, yeah, that's
against the
exactly
will
what
of
was
the
going.
Ukrainian people? You said they never had more than
Right.
20%.
Right.
Now that the eastern provinces have broken away, and I imagine probably in those eastern provinces, there's probably 2% that wanted to join NATO, if that.
Right.
So what percentage of the Ukrainian population that is not in the breakaway provinces do you think wants to join NATO? You probably don't have that number, but do you
Yeah.
think that the majority of Ukrainians in the non-occupied territories right now,
Well,
non-Russian controlled
right. Well, before
territories?
2014, yeah, if you looked at probably if you did a survey or you limited the survey to um, all provinces, or I guess we call them oblasts, other than Donetsk, Crimea, and Lugansk, it would still have to be well below 50% because we're talking about less than 20% of the population. So I mean, there still was a majority. Now, after the Maidan and after civil war broke out, it's just the atmosphere changed in Ukraine, and I would say that the propaganda organs began, you know, uh, spewing out a lot of pro-NATO propaganda, and also alternative news sources in that part of Ukraine that was still under Kiev were shut down one after another. I mean, now there just aren't any, and alternative parties too. Any party that's had any lean towards Russia, has some sympathy towards Russia that was maybe anti-NATO, they got shut down one after another over the course of the next several years up through the present. Now again, there are none. There are no,
Why
but they
why
used to
would
be there, and that's going to affect public opinion. Whether it's honest public opinion or not. Again, we talked about phone surveys. I don't know a lot of people after seeing all that. Okay, these opinions are illegal. Maybe I better not voice them.
Why would the US be so insistent on bringing Ukraine into NATO if the majority of Ukrainians, if less than
Oh,
20%
yeah,
of the
they
population
right.
didn't
They don't
want to be
they don't
part of
give a
NATO?
damn about that, right? I mean, it's
But,
not
but
about
what's
Ukraine. It's about
why?
Russia. It's about Russia. It's about um, simply weakening Russia. They
But did they
they're
feel like Russia was that much of a threat? I mean, after the Cold War, I mean,
right,
Russia was decimated. And
right.
that's the thing. The Soviet Union doesn't exist. We won the Cold War. It's
Uh-huh.
over. And now it's our team, our people. People like Jeffrey Sachs going in there and helping them set up. Our guys are in there involved in the
Right,
restructuring of Russia.
right.
So
Well,
they're not our enemies anymore, right?
right.
So
Well, things had already changed in Russia. I mean, in the 1990s, right, Russia was like flat on its back, right? And um, so we could do whatever we wanted, really. And we bombed Serbia, and Russia couldn't do anything about it. But that was a wake up call in Russia. There was kind of a humiliation. They saw a brother country being attacked, and they really couldn't do anything to protect it, right? But things changed, and that basically Putin came in power and began to rebuild Russia and arrested or disempowered the oligarchs. And this new Russia that was beginning to assert itself, that was the problem. When Russia was flat on its back, that was okay. We had nothing to worry about, right? But it's just the U.S. did not. I think it just came down to it. They saw that Russia was a threat to global U.S. hegemony.
more so than like China? I mean,
Well,
surely
not
not, right?
yeah, not more so, but it is a threat. It is a great power. It's not maybe a superpower. It's not on par with China, but it is still a great power.
But I mean,
And
Russia wasn't. It wasn't in. It's not invading other countries. It's not. I
right,
mean, he was getting involved a bit in the Middle East, like in Syria. It's true the
right,
Russian
at
military
the
was there.
invitation of the Assad government, right,
Hmm.
to fight, yeah, al-Nusra and ISIS.
Okay. So
Yeah. Well,
so there's.
there was a paper. I think it came out in 2019 by the Rand Corporation, which is pretty much the premier defense security think tank in the country in the U.S. And I'm trying to remember the title, but the the point of it is that they recommended a policy of weakening Russia and then maybe eventually bringing about regime change, but doing things whatever they could do to weaken Russia. To and it didn't draw a lot of attention at the time. But again, this is not just somebody an opinion piece in a paper. This is a Rand Corporation, very close to the defense establishment. And you can see from subsequent actions that basically that's the policy that they were pursuing. It was just that we're going to, when we can weaken Russia, we'll do it. And so when they had a choice between averting war, right, and making promises maybe not to keep NATO out of Ukraine, accepting Ukraine as a neutral country rather. But that wouldn't harm us in any way. I think it would obviously be good for the people of Ukraine, but it would end their plans to weaken Russia. And so when they saw a chance for war, they said, "Go for it. We're going to weaken Russia," and we got the economic sanctions and everything that followed. Now the whole thing seems to have blown up in their face, but that was the plan.
But why? What's the point? I mean, do they think that Russia's a real threat to the United States? What threat is Russia posing?
It's really not a threat to the United States. It's just a threat to the U.S. as a global hegemon.
Is it really? I mean,
well, in a way, it does. It's just that okay. As you can see now, right, is because they weren't able to destroy Russia. Now Russia has asserted itself, withstood the attacks, the economic sanctions, and the U.S. has been greatly weakened. Now, of course,
but that's because we try to weaken Russia. If we never try to weaken Russia, confiscating the Russian assets, putting all these sanctions, weaponizing the dollar, putting all these sanctions, our hegemon really relies on being the world financial center, being the world reserve currency. Our financial infrastructure is really what gives us the power. And it's a huge benefit to all Americans here that we get to, we are the world reserve currency and everybody wants our dollars. But now you forced it, you made this happen. Russia was not a threat for that. The ruble wasn't going to take over the dollar. As long as we should have been a bit more fiscally responsible because the amount of debt we had, I think, is a bit of an alarm for people that are holding onto U.S. treasuries. But then the weaponizing of the dollar and placing the sanctions was really, and forced, like you explained this very well before, forced the creation of BRICS plus. Essentially, we forced these countries to engage in international trade using their own currencies instead of using the U.S. dollar to build an alternative system to the U.S. dollar. That is the U.S. hegemon, I think, more than anything, is the dollar system. And now, from what we've done here, we are losing the dollar, the power of the dollar. Now countries realize, hey, I don't need to hold on to dollars to trade. I can use rubles and RMB to engage in cross-border commerce. And then the other thing that's been exposed is that, hey, actually, the U.S., the military hegemon part is not even so true anymore. It looks like the U.S. military isn't that great. Seems like they don't even have a single plant in America that builds TNT. Apparently, we can't produce many things. We're being exposed as a paper tiger.
Right.
We could have maybe maintained this hegemon illusion for much longer, or even if it's not militarily, as long as we were a country that never engaged in lawfare, and did not confiscate, and was apolitical when it came to currency, to the use of the dollar, that we weren't going to weaponize it, confiscate assets, then we could have maintained that dollar standard world reserve currency for indefinitely, as long as it was a fair, equitable system. But we didn't. In our effort to weaken Russia, we've destroyed our hegemony. We did. If we just were friendly with Russia, we could have preserved it. Is that true? Do you think?
Right. Yeah. Actually, everything you said was true. It's just what pride goeth before a fall. It's just a classic example of imperial overreach. It's because we wanted to maintain just really absolute hegemony that we've actually harmed ourselves. Our hegemony, we've put it at much greater risk than it was before. There's no question
I
about it.
don't understand even
Right.
now how that's preserving
Yeah.
our hegemony by,
Right. Well,
trying
yeah,
to
in our
attack
imagination, it's
some.
just that, well, the fact is, if you have a powerful independent state, any powerful independent state, that is not subordinate to the U.S., it does, well, it means that we have to take their interests into account, whether we're talking about, um,
Oh, how could we? Oh,
yeah,
wow.
exactly. Maybe some military adventure that we're planning in the Eastern European or maybe in a Caucasus country or something. We'd have to take them into account, and maybe negotiate with this other power, and maybe constrain our actions in some ways. Now you stop and say, well, why do we have to get involved in these other affairs? But these people just they've been masters of the universe. They've had this. They've been through the unipolar moment, and they just don't want to let it go of that sense that they could do anything they want. As what one of those neocons in the George W. Bush administration said, we create our own reality. Well, they no longer would they quite be able to achieve that level of supremacy. It's just that, oh gosh, we actually have to think a little bit about how the Russians might respond to this. Maybe we shouldn't do that. Just the thought of that seems to be intolerable to them. Again, it's a kind of madness, but it was what, and in the end, it backfired. This insistence on total hegemony has put their hegemony at great risk.
Yeah, the genie's out of the bottle now. I think there's no way to reestablish that hegemony anymore. It's
No,
over.
I was right. It was just, again, as you saw, well, the emperor has no clothes. I think
Mm.
that the failure of the sanctions, the sanctions from hell against Russia, really has just changed the world. I mean, everybody, you could see that, let's say these are the two gladiators fighting in the arena, and the one, lifts up his sword and it takes a mighty swing, and people look the other way, say, oh no, and then you turn back and look at the arena, and the other guy is standing, and he actually is, well, the
Mm.
one who swung the sword is stumbling on the other side, say, oh my, this is not what I thought. I was putting all my money on this guy. Let's run over to the bookie and change it to the other side. I mean, maybe it's
The
kind of
thing
a
is,
silly metaphor, but that's
yeah, I get it. But yeah, the thing is, like, we can't put the genie back in now because nobody's going to trust us at this point. The damage has been done, right? So there's no
right.
way to save the system, really, to save the US dollar, to save US hegemony. Even if we get back and admit, like, we were wrong, we're going to pull back our military escapades. We're not going to be expanding NATO. We're not going to weaponize the US dollar. We're not going to place sanctions on countries. People can engage in their own commerce. You can use our system. We're not going to just print off money and debase everybody's currency, all of your dollar holdings. We are going to be a fair, neutral country. You know, that's not possible now because of everything we did. Nobody's going to believe us now, and they shouldn't
Yeah, I mean,
because
right. Well, I mean, I guess you can slow the decline. I mean, the more that if they continue on this course, the dollar will decline all the more rapidly. You could slow it, but I think, yeah, at this point, the decline's inevitable. I mean, just with the rise of China and India and Russia, it's inevitable. And yeah, they could have maintained the hegemonic position of the dollar much longer if they hadn't done what they've done. But again, these things are based on trust above all, in a kind of in a faith in the system, and that faith has been,
irreparably
yeah, once it's
damaged.
lost, it's irreparably lost. Again, you say, okay, this is a flawed system. We saw behind the curtain. Like whatever.
Yeah. Why did I move back to the U.S.? Whenever we talk about these things, I'm like,
Yeah, right. You should move to
maybe
Portugal.
I was just seeing the streets, and I was thinking, like, man, yeah, I would love to live in Europe. Maybe we'll see one of these days.
Yeah,
It's still exciting to be
yeah.
here, even though we
Oh,
know that I'm in the beginning of the collapse. Not even, I would say, the decline. It's the beginning of the collapse here in the United States. It's exciting to think about what can come afterwards, and maybe I can be part of that system to build back again in this new system.
right.
It's an adventure. Maybe things could have been better if I stayed in Shanghai, but I'm here now, and I guess I'm
Yeah.
going to tough it out.